House Books.
All right, hello everyone. Let people file into the webinar. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris, and I'm very pleased to be hosting the launch for Manifesto for a Moral Revolution by Jacqueline Novogratz, the founder and CEO of Acumen. Thank you everyone for coming. You'll be able to ask questions through the Q&A function on your screen. You can also buy the book at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page, and it's also been reposted in the chat. Jacqueline will be in conversation with Jonathan Haidt, and let me introduce him now. Jonathan Haidt is a social psychologist who studies morality. He is the Thomas Cooley Professor of Ethical Leadership at New York University's Stern School of Business. He is the author of The Righteous Mind, The Happiness Hypothesis, and co-author of The Coddling of the American Mind. Hand it over to Jonathan and Jacqueline.
Well, thanks so much, Chris, and thanks so much to Powerhouse Books for hosting. As I think we're all kind of realizing, this is an age in which everything small is at risk of going away, and all businesses is at risk of going to Amazon and Walmart. So thank you for this event, for hosting us, and I hope everyone can check out the link to Powerhouse Books. So it is a thrill to be in conversation here with Jacqueline. I'll tell you a little bit about her. I'll set up the conversation. The best way I can set the table for a conversation with Jacqueline is with this quote from Buddha. Buddha says, "In this world, hate never yet dispelled hate. Only love dispels hate. This is the law, ancient and inexhaustible." And this is basically what Jacqueline does, except that she combines love with innovative financial instruments. So Jacqueline grew up in Virginia. She went to the University of Virginia. She then got an MBA from Stanford. She worked at Chase Manhattan Bank as an international credit consultant. She worked all over the world. She applied her banking skills to setting up the first microfinance institution in Rwanda. And it was doing this work at the borderline of finance and NGOs that gave her the big idea for which she is now justly famous, and that is patient capital. It's such a powerful idea that she's been named multiple times on lists of the top 100 global thinkers, for example, by Foreign Policy magazine. She's been on the cover of Forbes. She's been awarded several honorary doctorates. When I moved to NYU Stern, I was teaching at the University of Virginia. When I moved to Stern in 2011 and I began studying the moral foundations of capitalism, Jacqueline and I had such interesting conversations that eventually she invited me to join the advisory board of Acumen, and I've been on that for about 6 years now. One other psychological concept I want to put on the table here before I turn it over to Jacqueline is the fact that our brains are set up to be on a dimension of approach or avoid. And you can think of this as Caroline Webb, who has this wonderful book, How to Have a Good Day. She calls it, you're either in explore mode or you're in defend mode. And your brain is really set up to like, oh, there's opportunities, let's go get them. Or, whoa, there are threats, let's pull back and block out any threats. And we're very often in one of those two modes. We can't be in both at the same time. And in having watched Jacqueline work now in many, many contexts, what I can say is that Jacqueline's secret power is that she puts people into explore mode. She kind of reaches into their heads and their hearts, and she gently turns off defend mode, and then she puts them in explore mode, and then she calls them into the land of nuance. That's the second trick. So she sets your mind to be receptive, and then she introduces nuance. And when I asked her in our prep call to prepare for this event, I said, what's the most important idea or insight you want participants to take away? And she said, quote, if they leave with one thing, it is the realization that the only way we get out of here is to learn to navigate these opposing values and truths. So that's what's so magnificent about this book. I think we're going to start the discussion by applying this framework, or I'll give Jacqueline a chance to show her stuff. We'll start with capitalism in general. And so that you could, because it's important that you see what she does, what Acumen does. And then we'll move to the more fraught and difficult topic of identity. And along the way, we'll talk about moral leadership and maybe a few moral revolutions. So capitalism. Jacqueline, can you, people need to understand how you work, what Acumen is. So can you give us a brief example of a successful company that would probably not have been successful without Acumen, and then explain to us, or show us, how do these companies make the lives of the poor better? Because that's Acumen's mission.
Thanks, John, and thanks to Powerhouse. And John, honestly, that is the nicest introduction anyone has ever done, and I'd love to get that quote from the Buddha. I'd never heard it. And it shows your magnificent way of being in the world, and so it's just an honor to be with you. So thank you. Capitalism and patient capital. So, Acumen is 19 years old now, and in a way, I want to start with the fact that we essentially invest the right kind of capital into the right kind of character, and we surround it with the right community to make change. And so John asks me, one example. The company, which is in many ways a unicorn for Acumen, except in the impact space, is a company called Hight. So you've got two kids out of business school, 2007. It's a time in the world where 1.5 billion people in the world have no access to electricity. So a big, hairy problem, extremely complex. They've got this audacious idea that they want to bring electricity to the poor, but they have no idea how to start. Acumen likes these kind of guys that have the character that we actually believe can hold these tensions of being humble and audacious. So we start off with a $250,000 philanthropic-backed investment with the plan that we will be patient to allow them to try and possibly fail and try again. Over a 13-year period. So when I say patient capital, I mean patient capital. 13-year period, we put $5 million of philanthropic-backed equity and debt into building this company. And we learn that we need more than the capital. And so we also bring in talent, the equivalent of 12 years of a human being's skilled talent. And then we have to use our social capital, our community. And so we connect this company to corporations and to foundations that can help lend their supply chains, enable distribution. Because to put this in perspective, this is a company that has to figure out how to bring electricity to 1 billion people who have never had it, who don't have trust, who make $2 or $3 a day, who have no financing, and who have very little infrastructure. What they have around them is corruption and bureaucracy. And so patient capital is about going where traditional investors will not go and staying there with a real accompaniment mindset. This last January at Davos, Sam Goldman and Ned Tozing announced that Hight had brought electricity, solar affordable electricity, to over 100 million of the world's low-income people.
Wow, 100 million.
100. Profitable company, investors getting repaid, and along the way, Acumen learned with them what it could mean to build an energy revolution. So we then have since become the largest off-grid investor in the world for the poor. And I'm watching, John, this energy revolution now take over. And despite this, crisis teaches you a lot. And crisis is showing us that there are now about 500 companies that do this work. And they account for about 350,000 jobs in Africa. And so suddenly you have a different economic and frankly political model for creating a more anti-fragile approach to bringing electricity to poor people in a way that increases income, reduces energy poverty, and helps avert long-term climate crisis.
Okay, so that is a beautiful, beautiful example. That is a demonstration of the power of business to change people's lives, to have effects at gigantic scale.
Yes.
but yet it's things that don't happen on their own. Somehow businesses, even though there's an opportunity to make money, there are people who have a need, but somehow businesses don't get there. And Acumen has found ways to get, well, not get businesses from there to there, but businesses that are already there in those countries, right? It's generally you're helping businesses in those countries to grow.
Yeah, exactly. In this case, the entrepreneurs were not African, although Sam had lived for 5 years in a West African village, so he'd been immersed in the understanding. But Delight is based in Nairobi, Kenya, and all of its operations, most of its operations are now inside. And again, seeing the jobs and the career paths of these young people have been extraordinary.
Yeah, so I went on an Acumen trip with you to India, and I think it was 2016. And just to see, we visited all these companies, and to see, it's almost as though, and the Indian companies were almost all from Indian entrepreneurs. To see like seeds planted, and then just lots of water, fertilizer, things happen, and then you get this garden blooming. And I just want to share just briefly the example that I will never forget. The company was called LifeSpring. And on this one day, this was one of the most powerful emotional days of my life. In the morning, we went to the public hospital where women went to give birth, and there were no resources. It was like visiting a mental asylum that was underfunded, and there was just crying and wailing and dirt and blood, and the women who were allowed in to go, they were actually allowed into the delivery room, saw premature babies basically being held by their mothers, just likely to die, not being cared for. It was one of the most awful things I've ever seen. And then that afternoon, we went to the LifeSpring Hospital, which figured out how to bring women through birth for $125 for the whole thing, like prenatal, postnatal, and childbirth was joyous. And there were sheets on the beds. And so it just, the emotional, I mean, we're talking about business opportunities here, but the emotional impact of bringing of the innovative businesses that help the poor live lives of dignity was just so wonderful to see. Okay, so with that, and now I hope everyone listening has a sense of just how amazing this company, Acumen, is. So now I have a challenge for you. Let's see if you can do this nuanced thing on the fly. So here's a hypothetical. Suppose someday when we're allowed to fly again, and you're sitting in the middle seat on a long flight, and on one side of you, you have a 26-year-old woman who says that capitalism is an oppressive system of exploitation, and she thinks we need to have socialism. And then on the other side of you, you've got a 60-year-old man in the finance industry who says, capitalism is the greatest thing that ever happened to the poor. Look how it's lifted billions out of poverty. And so, you've got this argument over the moral status of capitalism. You're sitting right there in the middle. And let's even suppose, to simplify things, let's even suppose that both of them consider themselves Democrats who are on the left on social issues, but they're just totally apart on the economic left-right thing. Okay, what would you say to them? How would you mediate this? How would you get them to some higher state?
Can I start with the man first?
Sure.
Okay, thanks. So I think I would, acknowledge them. And I would start with the man who I'm close to his age, a few years younger, and say, look, I went to business school probably when you did, and we were taught that it was not only our fiduciary duty, but our ethical duty to maximize shareholder wealth. And as you just said, over the last 30 years, I went to business school in 1991. We've seen almost 1 billion people lifted out of poverty, because what the market does for us is serve as a listening device. Unlike top-down approaches like the government hospital that you saw, where bureaucrats can decide what we need or what we don't need, the market allows freedom, efficiency. It moves capital to where it will be most efficiently used. And it has allowed a huge flowering of individual freedom and opportunity. And that's exciting. However, and now I would turn to the woman, I would say, over the last 30 years, I've also seen capitalism raised as an ideology to the rank of a religion. And we have gotten so beholden to the shareholders that we have forgotten about the other critical stakeholders of capitalism, the earth, the poor, and we become more divided and more divisive than ever in our lifetime. And so we've traded off individualism and freedom for the health of a community and of society. And so the idea must be to understand how we use the market as a listening device, but also recognize its limitations. So markets don't listen to everyone. Markets often overlook the poor because they don't see an opportunity to make money off the poor or even with the poor. Markets can exploit the poor as well. And so understanding the moral dimensions, which, you know, it's a bankrupt idea that the moral dimension is simply make shareholders rich in an interdependent world where we know how dependent we are on each other. However, we've got to use the best of the market and recognize that we are each other's destiny, and that people do not deserve the level of education they can afford only. People do not deserve the level of primary health care that they can afford only. We are the system. We get to decide what sits at the center of the system. And for the past 30 years, we've only had profit, money, power, fame, the individual in the center. It's time to shift it to putting our shared humanity and the sustainability of the earth there as well.
Bravo, bravo, beautiful. So, okay, so
I passed, John.
You passed. I hope you know,
the
right.
righteous mind.
Well, I wanted participants to see how you can take some of the biggest debates, the biggest fights that we've been having in this country for decades, and you can basically. Yeah, and you can basically go in and sort of acknowledge what each side is right about. And since the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, you know, when we all thought like, okay, things are going to change, and you know, but what's the alternative to capitalism? There isn't any alternative, but there are different forms of it. And now, with this COVID crisis, now when it's much clearer to us who's being hurt, who we need, there's a much bigger opportunity to really reorder our priorities. And so just to everybody listening, if you're thinking about the future, if you're thinking about political reforms, if you're interested in these sorts of issues, Acumen and this book give you a guide to a kind of a future kind of economy, a future economic system that really can appeal to people on the left, right, libertarian, all over the place. So I highly recommend the book for those issues as well. Okay, so now let's really turn to the book and let's talk about moral revolution. Because when I first saw that was the title of your book, I was like, huh? Wait, revolution? That doesn't seem. Yeah, that doesn't seem like Jacqueline. She's, you know, because they're like standing on the barricades, you know, burning things and protesting. So that doesn't seem like the Acumen way to me. Tell me, what is an Acumen style moral revolution? What do you mean by that term?
So it's funny because I wanted to title the book Hard-Edged Hope. But some people thought it was way too soft. My publisher hated Manifesto for a Moral Revolution. And you might like this part, John, because they thought that Manifesto sounded too much like too many of the terrorists. Moral sounded like the Christian right. Revolution sounded like Bernie Sanders. So I was like, okay, we might have something here.
That actually, yeah, that could work. Yeah.
That could work.
Yeah, matter, antimatter, just put them together. That would actually be a pretty good metaphor.
I love tension. And so for me, and where I think we need to go, again, as an interdependent world, you started with the quote from the Buddha, even though you were born very Western in New York, in the United States. And for me, moral in an interdependent world is not a prescribed set of rules that have been defined by some higher authority, but moral sits at the interstices, if you will, of human dignity. It has to be defined by who we want to be and how we want to be, so that my right does not mean you're wrong. That I cannot live in a world where whatever is good for me, I assume is good for you. That is not moral. The revolution part of that is trying to get to this idea that it will not come on high, and it frankly will not come only from below. It has to come from within. Our systems are far too complex for any single entity to hold all of the responsibility for determining the system by which we will all act more ethically. This has got to be government making decisions differently, private sector making decisions differently, the universities, the media, the civil society, and it's got to lead to new role models, business models, and ultimately the stuff you write about. We need a different ethos to build.
So can you give us an example of where Acumen brought about moral change, or where Acumen, or with the companies and all the fellows and the whole, where you brought about, if not moral revolution, at least transformation, growth, where this unique approach centered in dignity and with all these moral virtues that, and a best story would be where you hit a wall, there were obstacles, but you overcame them. So do you have any stories of successful change like that?
I only have stories of things like that, John. And again, it's not just Acumen, it's the entrepreneurs and why we focus so much on character. I didn't quite understand, which sounds silly now in retrospect, how the status quo exists so powerfully because it works for people. And taking that on is a long, hard process of real change, and how when it works, you see humanity just flourishing. And so I think about an ambulance company in India where I was teased rather mercilessly and publicly when we made an investment in a guy that had 9 ambulances to take on the multi-billion-dollar bloated, corrupt industry in India, and but knew that we were betting on the right character to disrupt. And at the beginning, it was everything from trying to get a number like 911 that people would remember, but if you don't pay a bribe, the number that we ended up getting was 1298. Really hard. And if you're in a panic, when you were talking about before brains, you look for the 12 after the 9 on your telephone. So it was just a disaster, just training a population. What I saw over time, however, was that once people in the society, particularly the poor, who for the first time in their lives started to understand that if they called a number, an ambulance would arrive, started to feel more like citizens. And I saw that ambulance drivers, who still don't make that much money, we're talking a few dollars a day, the courage they would have. So for instance, when the Bombay terror attacks occurred, that's when I knew we were transforming a system and possibly part of a society, when the only ambulances in front of the burning buildings in Mumbai were our ambulances.
Oh, wow. In the rest of the city had no other response system. Your company was the response system.
I mean, there were a few others that were private ambulances.
But they didn't show up.
They were, I didn't see them because I was watching it. The dominant color in CNN coverage were the yellow ambulances. And this company took about 130 people out of the hotels that night, while the terrorists were still armed and shooting people inside. And when I talked to the ambulance drivers after, these guys who made a couple of dollars a day, I said, what gave you the courage to run into these burning buildings while the shooters were still killing everyone? And this man looked at me like I asked him what he had for breakfast. And he said, madam, it is our duty. Mm-hmm. And I suddenly was like, I'm sitting in front of a giant, and what this company has done has shown what's possible. And then we saw, again, the limitation of the market. At that point, it was a private company. The only way you scale it is to learn how to partner with government. Once that happened, it could grow to be one of the largest ambulance companies in the world. 75% of the people inside are poor. So we went through a lot of very, very difficult times learning how to build a company, then learning how to partner. But this is where you see you can actually create change if you're willing to go into those uncomfortable places and really see that discomfort almost as proxy, John, for progress.
Beautiful. And again, the patience that this takes years and years of banging your head against something until you find where things give way. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let's move on now to a more difficult and a difficult topic, which is the issue of well, identity, really. So obviously, identity issues have been important for a very, very long time, and in reading the book, I thought I knew so much about you, but in reading the book, I hear so many stories from your childhood and your 20s. So I'd like you to tell this, maybe very briefly tell the story of your painful year in 1996, leading a Rockefeller Foundation project to create next generation leaders. Now, I don't need to go into it in too much detail, but it seems like a kind of a failure that you learned from and that has given you skills. Just to set the table here a bit, I wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, came out in 2018, and it's about a lot of changes that happened on campus and a lot of conflict and difficulty we've been having on American college campuses and British, Canadian college campuses as well, with conflicts over identity, over gender, race, LGBT. Now, these are, of course, important issues that we've been struggling with and wrestling with for a long time. I think we've been making a lot of progress over the decades, but things really kind of bubbled up and became more difficult in recent years, in part due to social media, in part due to, which has the ability to uncover injustices we didn't know. So there are a lot of reasons why it's more intense now, but it's intense and it's really difficult to deal with, and nobody's really found a good way. And these issues that were so powerful on campus from between 2015, 2016, now that Gen Z, kids born in 1996 and later, now that they're graduating and moving out into the corporate world, when I talk with corporate executives, they say they're being eaten alive by these kinds of conflicts. And this is especially true in organizations that lean left. Conservative organizations have less of these issues in them, it seems. So universities, nonprofits, progressive companies are having, they mean well, they're trying to work this out, but they're not making much progress. They're at a dead end. And I saw a lot of hope in your book for a different way. So maybe just tell us, how did how would you address that, and where did you get that knowledge?
Well, I think, I think maybe I'm not that smart, John, because I think I get all my knowledge from just getting beaten up all the time, trying and falling down, right?
You're anti-fragile.
I'm anti-fragile. That is one thing for sure. And so I had already worked in Rwanda. I'd already seen, massive ethnic tensions and thought I was good at navigating. I'm the eldest of 7. I thought I was good at navigating all of this. And as John said, in the late 90s, which was another time of identity politics.
Yeah.
We had Rodney King for young people. This was a time when a Black guy got beaten, captured on video, and it sent, even though this
beaten by the police.
By the police. Thank you for that. And the city went crazy, and the foundation said we need to find a way to create a deliberately diverse core of American leaders and give them the skills of navigating difference. And Jacqueline, we want you to create it, build a team, and run it. I thought I was the wrong person to do it, and I let them know that, but never want to say no to a challenge. I took it on. Long story short, I made a lot of mistakes. The biggest mistake that I made in this very diverse core was to not really reconcile my own identity, in that, we think of identity at top level, race, ethnicity, class, etc. My identity was, I was a scrappy, entrepreneurial, anti-fragile person who had traveled the world, paid my way through school, took care of myself. I wasn't privileged. And there was this young, very brash, very left African-American man who really was going to be a force in that group, and often held the whole group hostage from having a conversation across all these lines of difference, which was the whole reason for the course. And I didn't know how to manage. I didn't know how to navigate. And part of the problem was that I didn't know who I was in this mix. And he called me out once and essentially said what I thought what I kind of felt inside, which was, Jacqueline, you should resign. You shouldn't run this course. You're too white. You're too privileged. And I remained stoic in the moment, but I went home, had a good cry, thought about what is happening here, because I would be so defensive. I'm not privileged. And that night, after my tears, I thought, well, I used to maybe not be privileged, although even as a kid, I understood that I had a lot of privileges that other kids didn't have. It was a part of my own ethos of growing up. But now I have a Stanford MBA. Now I work at the Rockefeller Foundation. I have a passport. My skin is white. I look privileged. And so it really doesn't matter what I feel on the inside. How people see me is different. And I have a passport to the world. And so that changed everything for me, because I also realized I am not showing my full self, nor am I holding the group accountable to learning with me. Because during that first year, which I didn't put in the book, John, but every time I would mention Rockefeller, they'd be like, it's the, capitalist imperialist Rockefeller, and they're ruining the country. And so I decided to stay, because I listened to many of the other voices, which I wasn't even hearing in that first year. I decided to stay, and I started to understand that my privilege could be used as a liability, or it could be used as a real asset within the group and for the group. And that in fact, my privilege brought with it deep responsibility to be extended. And that if I had the confidence to go into that group, acknowledging it, not hiding it in a way that I see too many young people doing today, but still making space for others as part of my responsibility, then I could help these young people grow in much more effective ways. And so by the second year, when someone would talk about the the capitalist imperialist institution of the Rockefeller Foundation, I'd be like, true. And you have just signed up to put that on your resume. And if it shames you, you have a choice right now. Because you can be a trust fund kid and hate your parents, or you can hold the discomfort of what it means to navigate an institution that will forever mark you as part of the elite, whether you like it or not. And with that, I hope you now open doors for other people. And John, it's really been part of the way I have built Acumen with my team, that I watch too many people in the world hold on to a story of their youth, and they never change it. One, it's boring. Right. But two, they're not expanding their multiple identities. And the more identities that we hold within ourselves, the more chances we have to use our identity as a tool to connect to others, rather than something to be weaponized and divide. And so in some ways, the luckiest leaders in terms of having a head start in navigating a truly interdependent world do have the most layers of identity, because they can say, oh, I see you. You might be a Muslim Pakistani man who shows up, but I have a part of you in me, because I bet you're also an athlete. Maybe you're a mediator or a vegetarian. I can find these different pieces. And so if we can think about the many different identities we hold inside ourselves, find a way to connect, and recognize that if we're privileged, it is our responsibility to be the bridge, to listen, to open, and to call things out, to help build rooms where people get comfortable being uncomfortable, knowing that you're going to hold them till we start to build skills of really navigating these differences and getting to solutions that we can all see ourselves in. Beautiful.
So you start. This is that sort of jujitsu thing that you do so well. When somebody's expecting a confrontation, you give and you say, you're right about something. I acknowledge what you're right about. Now, let's make this more complicated. let's look at what's going to happen here. What do you want to do? And you meet them, you bring more, you complexify things in a way that, again, people see possibilities. You put them in explore mode and they see additional possibilities rather than just girding for battle as they were at the start. That is great. So now, do you have any advice for, so let's bring it right into 2020, for anybody leading a company, leading an organization or a nonprofit, where there are a lot of internal conflicts. Social media, it seems as though what used to be a small conflict can quickly blow up and go public. Anybody leading an organization now seems to have a harder job than they did 5 or 8 years ago. Do you have advice for how to create a culture that is truly inclusive, that puts people into much more this mode of giving the benefit of the doubt and able to turn what could be conflicts into opportunities for growth? What would you say to leaders now?
I would say, importantly, number one, assume goodness and make that a mantra that your organization lives with. I remember once when we had, you talked about drip irrigation, and we were trying to get the drip irrigation that had been licensed in India into Pakistan. We had 2 amazing entrepreneurs, but they weren't that good at returning phone calls to anybody. But when the Indian didn't return the call to the Pakistani or vice versa, they'd call me and they're like, he hates me. I'm like, actually, he's just not that good at returning phone calls. Assume goodness and call the guy and say, hey, you haven't called me, and see what happens. And so 1, assume goodness. 2, you started to say it, John. When there's tension, can you recognize a truth or even a partial truth in what the other is saying and take a step forward toward them? Because that will open a field for a different kind of conversation. 3, I've been really influenced by India in this way, where in America, so often we lead with one part of our identity, or we sanitize the whole thing because we're too afraid to show who we are and recognize other people can. And so, happy holidays or in your face, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, yeah.
It's such a silly argument.
Yes.
In India, I might see him on the street and say, John, happy Passover, not happy Passover, but I might come up with happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, happy Kwanzaa. I could just say the whole thing and celebrate. And so at Acumen, we celebrate it all. And there's a great joy that people have in sharing their traditions with each other without feeling that they're imposing or converting or convincing, but they want to make an offering. And so I think it's partially the way we use language and create spaces. Rumi, the 13th century Sufi poet, says, beyond right doing and wrong doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay. All right. So let's just talk a couple more minutes. I have one more question for you, and then we'll open it up to questions. I think Chris is going to enable the question function. I hope that those listening in will be able, it'll be clear how you can ask questions and put them. I'm not sure, I guess it's a separate question function off the chat. So here's my question for you. When I read the book, of course it just came out. It was perfectly timed for the spring graduation season. It really is, and you said somewhere, it's like a love letter to young idealists. And in my tweets about it, I've emphasized, this is a great present to get for a college grad. Now, of course, bringing a book, and then suddenly the COVID epidemic hits, and it's a terrible time to give birth to a child or a book in terms of the ability to, it's just what if you were, and you do get asked to give a lot of graduation speeches, I know. What would you, don't give the whole speech, but what would you say to, to young idealists who want to go out there and change and protest or whatever, however they want to make change? What's just, a minute or two of advice or 1 or 2 principles? What would you say to a 21-year-old college grad who wants to go change the world?
I would say, as You know, first of all, I would just honor how scared most of them must feel, looking at the job situation, feeling like they got completely ripped off from a real college graduation in their last senior year. Um, and, um, and so I think I might talk a little bit about narrative, and then in some ways, as they look back on this, they're always going to be the Corona graduates, and that may end up being an extraordinary part of their long-term narrative, even though it feels short-term lousy. Two, I think I would say, there is no time like right now to be young, because you, the graduates, can see things that older people may have become hardened to seeing, in terms of the way that the world works, where we say, well, that will never work. You can say, why not? And if you don't know exactly how to build that why not world, then I would say the third thing, just start, let the work teach you. That if we knew how to build the world, we would have built it. And that along the way, you're going to be called idealist, naive. You're going to be told you don't know what you're doing. You're going to be told you're crazy. But something that really strengthens me is what Gandhi said, which was, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. And that has been such a mantra for the hundreds of companies my organization has helped build, and the millions of people, hundreds of millions that those companies have helped serve. Know that people out there have your back. Recognize that the people old like me actually have wisdom, so use it, but don't be held back by it. And build a cohort of friends now that can walk with you, because this work is hard, and because you need to find things and people that believe in you along the way.
Beautiful, beautiful. So I just want to emphasize, you know, the in addition to the sort of the love, the openness, the nuance, a virtue we haven't mentioned, but I think it's throughout the book, is humility, is the sense that you don't know the answer. As you said, let the work teach you. And if you come into it knowing exactly what needs to be done and how to do it, you're probably wrong, or you're going to alienate people. And so much what you say is about listening, because you don't know the answer until you really get in, work with people, listen to them as customers, listen to them as citizens. So again, it's just an extraordinary book, and I think you've seen Jacqueline in action here. Okay, so we welcome questions. Go ahead and type your questions in to the question box. And Jacqueline, can you see the question box, or is it just me?
I think it's just you.
Okay. Okay.
I do. A colleague at the community college.
Okay. Okay. So if you, I'll read it. I'll read it out loud, and then we'll let you answer it. From an anonymous attendee, a colleague at the community college where I teach has this quote in their email signature line, and I'm wondering if you could comment on it, both in terms of content and context. Quote, the defining question is whether the discrimination is creating equity or inequity. If discrimination is creating equity, then it is anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, then it is racist. And this is from Ibram Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. What do you think of that quote?
Wow, that's a heavy quote. I'm not sure I fully know what I think of it. I think the idea, this is back to the way I think I'm understanding it would be in the context of universities, that an affirmative action policy to create diversity within a school system that gave people opportunity that wouldn't otherwise have it, would be in the category of anti-racist, and one that continues to preference legacy and athletes, maybe in the category of racist. You know, again, I always make pleas for nuance, and I do think that different kinds of affirmative action programs have different ends and means. And that what becomes very important is this intention of building systems in which everybody can participate. Mm-hmm. And so when we first started the Fellows Program, it was really important to me that we would identify people from a diverse core of people from, let's say, across India or Pakistan or Ethiopia. And we didn't really have a policy, but we certainly had an intention. And it didn't look exactly like it was supposed to look at the beginning, but over time, man, did we let the work teach us. And equity was at the heart of it. But the question I keep asking myself is, who decides? Who decides what's fair? How do we decide what's fair? And so I think I'm still swimming in that question, John. I wonder how you would answer it.
Yeah, well, I see the point of it, but I think there are a lot of things that make sense, but they bring with them certain assumptions, which when you look at the assumptions, you then wonder, wait, do we really want to make those assumptions? So I think this is premised on a vision of a society or a college community or something as composed of groups that are in a zero-sum struggle. And therefore, if there is inequality between the groups, it is appropriate to discriminate against the group that has more privilege, because that is discriminating against people to create equality between groups. And I think there are times when it might make sense to think about people as groups, but when you do that, you are treating real human beings, you're discriminating against real human beings in ways that create additional inequity. So for example, when you said, well, if we're talking about, why do we give athletes and legacies so much an advantage? Well, yeah, that does seem like, well, that's not really fair. But if you're just saying, here's a poor kid from a, working class single mother family, but he's white, therefore we're not going to let him in. Well, it's once you start saying the groups that matter are racial groups, and we don't care about anything else. Now, I think you're discriminating to rectify one kind of inequity, but you're creating others. So I think that's at the heart of that's why affirmative action and arguments over how to do it are interminable. They're going on for decades and decades. So I think I see the point of that quote, but I think it's premised on a notion of seeing people not as individual human beings, but as representatives of racial groups that I think that causes other problems and tends to be divisive. So I think I would love to see Acumen devise a total approach to inclusion that would take a common humanity approach. That was a theme that came out.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so moving on. Okay, here's a good question for you. Jacqueline, what drives you? When are you happiest?
I think human connection drives me, and seeing that the fruits of my efforts are made manifest. And so there is nothing in the world like investing in a person or in a company and watching them shine. I remember the first time, we invested in this bed net company way back, 18 years back, when it had this dream that they would be the first company to have an African solution to an African problem, malaria. And watching those early machines going and thinking, we're doing it. There's a great sense of pride. But when I'm most joyful, John, which I think is different from happiest, is in those moments of deep, profound human connection. I think you were with me with many of them when you're transcending all of these lines of difference and meeting another human being, person to person, with a great sense of curiosity about who they are, and feeling that reciprocated. I think that's when I feel most joyful.
Yeah, that fits with everything I've seen about you, and it fits with the person who comes through in the book. Okay, there are two questions here about sort of progressive approaches to business and how things might be changing. So there's one from Doug Vahey. There's another one from an anonymous attendee. I'll read this one. They overlap. Oh, wait, hold on a second. No, it was, oh, well, where was the question? Oh, here it is, from Daniel Oliver. Has the role of progressive enterprise that can change systems within Western capitalism or capitalist democracies, has it changed in light of the current situation? And I think my understanding of it, of the question, is just more like, given that there are going to be changes to capitalism, or everyone's talking about it, have you seen, are there, be it co-ops was the other question, are there kinds of business or ways of structuring business or categories or ideas you've seen internationally that can create better, more inclusive forms of capitalism that you would recommend that young entrepreneurs, people graduating from business school, that they might look into?
Oh my goodness. I mean, talk about happy and joy. That this is where I get so happy, because I feel like 10 years ago, John, when you first started, really getting to know Acumen, we had all these ideas, but it was so easy to be like, oh, that's so exciting, but it's small. Mm-hmm. We're not that anymore. And so now I'm seeing an entire generation of entrepreneurs with these progressive ideas, with circular economy ideas, with co-op and ESOP, employee ownership models, really challenge us also around how do you not only measure environmental impact, but on the social side, how do we measure participation and asset ownership, not just the jobs that are created and the income that is earned. In this COVID, so I wanted to say two quick ideas. In the COVID moment, because of this crisis, there's a pressure to pivot and change fast that is offering huge opportunity. So we have a company called Every Table that was started by a Wall Streeter named Sam Polk in Los Angeles. Sam had seen food deserts, and so he wanted to do something about the lack of healthy food in places like Compton. And so he started off with the nonprofit years ago and saw the resilience and the power of low-income women in that community, but it wasn't moving fast enough, and started to see that in food deserts, there aren't a lot of opportunities for really healthy, fresh food. And so people often have to go to fast food restaurants. Mm. So he decided to experiment with a nutritious, affordable, fast food restaurant called Every Table that became so popular so quickly, again, providing really good jobs in the community, that he now has 8 restaurants. Mm. When the stay-at-home order happened, Sam, because he's driven by purpose, not by profits, he sends out a tweet that says, if you need food, our mission is to get healthy, affordable, nutritious food to you. Let us know. We'll deliver it. If you can pay, let us know. If you can't pay, let us know. If you can pay it forward, let us know that. And within a couple of weeks, they've gotten from local philanthropy and small contributions enough for 160,000 meals. Then the moral imagination of the governor, Gavin Newsom, who then says, we're going to put homeless people into hotels. And now they're partnering with Every Table. So by the end of the month, they will have delivered 1 million meals. And so I'm watching in real time this movement from a private company working in one community, now partnering with ride shares, partnering with government, partnering with philanthropists at a crowd-funded level to solve a problem. From the developing world, there are so many models of really gutsy companies, as I said, that are using both the circular economy model, which you're starting to see in the United States, where you use waste, recycled waste, and you convert it into things that are useful and productive as part of this virtuous chain cycle. Others where young entrepreneurs are turning the model of capitalism upside down, and rather than paying farmers in coffee and cocoa according to global commodities prices, understanding production prices of farmers and building their pricing structure from there to keep the farmers whole. One of the models that really excites me from the developing world that I think America could use to help heal itself is what I would call the accompaniment model. Accompaniment comes from the Jesuit idea of walking alongside. I'll hold a mirror to you. I will help you see your potential, maybe even more than you can see it yourself. Amartya Sen, the economist, Indian economist, says, it's one thing to provide access and opportunity. And this is where I think sometimes the right is right and wrong. it's one thing, we need to provide access and opportunity, but if people don't have the capability to make use of that access and opportunity, it goes for naught. The Accompany model helps them do that. It was really made quite prevalent with HIV/AIDS, where when people needed to take their antiretrovirals and eat a certain amount of healthy calories, community health workers, so plain people from the community who were trained in the rudiments of healthcare, would accompany them. They would call them in the morning. You okay? How you feeling? Take medicine. And it had an enormous impact on fighting the AIDS virus. I'm seeing that showing up now in American entrepreneurs, many of whom learn from the developing world, but they're importing that model. And when I think about our broken criminal justice system, our opioid crises, our healthcare crises, our education crises, we could actually build an economic model, John, based on taking our ordinary citizens, training them, and helping them accompany each other to become better versions of ourselves.
Perfect. Perfect. When I joined Stern in 2011, it was like being an anthropologist coming to a foreign culture. The whole ethos of a business school is so different from the rest of the university. And people kept talking about creating value, creating value. And at first I thought it was just a buzzword. But now I've really come to see, like, no, that's how people get things. That's how humanity advances, is that people create value. And sometimes you're trying to create value and keep as much of the surplus as you can for yourself. But I think the accompaniment model is more like a stakeholder view where you're saying, who has untapped potential? Let's help them create the most value that they can. And out of that bounty, goodness will flow to everybody, and some portion will come to me as profit from my company. And yeah, wow, that is an inspiring vision of business for the 21st century. Let's end with a question. There's actually a question, it's from me, but it's actually perfect for both of us. From Luis Raul Diaz. John, your recent work has addressed group polarization in college campuses, though group polarization has also increased nationally and internationally. Do you think the pandemic will make groups more polarized or less polarized? So let's both of us end with our guess as to what the hell is going to happen. So I'll just, to put on the table, the way I think about this is that there are two situations that we understand very, very well. One is a foreign attack by an enemy, like Pearl Harbor. That is just perfect for pulling us all together. And there's research by Joe Henrich and others showing that if your country was attacked when you were in your teens, you are more cooperative 10, 20 years later. It's permanent. You are more cooperative. Foreign attack. That's not what this is. The other extreme is a pandemic, a plague in the old days when there was no food and people were fighting over food and we didn't know what was causing it. And the death rate was 50% for the bubonic plague. That really turns people against each other. That is really ugly. David Brooks had a great column on plague writing. Okay, even though ours is a pandemic, it's not that. We're pretty physically safe, we're cooperating. So those are the two extremes. What we have is something in the middle. And it started off much more, we're in it together. Peggy Noonan had a beautiful phrase from a poet. It's, we're not all in the same boat, but we're all in the same storm. And now gradually, we don't even, half of us believe there's a storm, half of us believe the sun is now shining. So, we started off much more on the more group cohesion, but that was not going to last. We're drifting over more towards we're coming apart, especially given that we have a presidential election and we have, our leadership is tweeting divisive things. So I'm not optimistic about this year, but our democracy was in terrible shape before this, and I had very little hope before this. Now, at least, things are being broken open. A lot is going to change. We have a new generation that I think is going to be better citizens because of this. So even though I'm not optimistic overall necessarily, now at least I see a lot of possibilities that if we get through this next difficult year, there are a lot of possibilities where things could get better. We did need to break a lot of things and rethink a lot of things about our economy, our politics, our voting system, a lot. So I'm hopeful in that sense. I'm not sure which way I'd bet, but there are a lot of really exciting possibilities. That's my answer. Jacqueline, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, not that dissimilar, John. I think that we are sitting at this precipice of enormous possibility and also real peril, because I've now worked in a lot of war zones, and this moment is, as you said, not a war with an external enemy, but that has elements of fear, and fear can make us prey on, fear can make us go into those broken parts of ourselves, and that is where you start to see xenophobia and blame. And so for me, this comes down to moral leadership, and what I don't think we can depend on the political leaders only, although every one of us has to vote and fight to get the right leaders in, because there's a whole other narrative that needs to be told in the United States. This is a moment to see our best selves in the entrepreneurship, in the innovation, in the way communities are coming together, in the way neighbors are finding one another. And so this is a time for the storytellers to step forward and to create and recreate and create again those narratives that we are better than we think we are sometimes. Because I do believe, like you believe, that the cracking open is helping us refocus on our priorities. It is impossible to read the news and not see what the rest of the world is starting to see about America. Yeah. And that is not who we want to be. Yeah. The one that has the worst record, the one that has the most chaotic systems. We've got to fix all that. And within that is an enormous opportunity for us to rediscover solidarity. But that comes down to leadership. And I think it's why I feel such a deep sense of commitment to this work, to celebrating the right role models and to finding those business models that really do enable dignity. And I think that's why I wrote this book.
Okay, well, so if we can get the right business models, if we can improve the nature of capitalism, if we can each act as humble leaders who can turn off the defensive system and help people see nuance, if we can do all of this, I think we might just be set up for a moral revolution just in time. Jacqueline, it's always such a joy to talk with you. Thanks to everybody who joined us on this call. Remember that you can buy Jacqueline's book, Manifesto for a Moral Revolution, at Powerhouse Books. The link is in the chat. If you're in New York City, someday, whenever you're allowed to, please go to Brooklyn to the store in Dumbo.
John, can I add one other thing to the pitch, which I so appreciate? Which is we really do want to support independent bookstores like Powerhouse. And also with this book until May 26th, we have a master course online, which is a 12-week course that we normally will sell for $200. And it's free if you buy the book, because we really want to start to experiment with online. Can you teach online moral education, character building? And it's a pretty exciting course with lots of diverse voices that bring life to these principles and practices.
So there you go. Get the book, get the $200 course for free, and you're off creating your own moral revolution. Jacqueline, Chris at Powerhouse, thanks to you all. Thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Awesome. Thank you, Jacqueline and Jonathan, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. And if you missed any event, it will be on YouTube soon. And please buy the book. It's 10% off. And you get the 12-step course.
Thanks a million.
Thank you.